David stood before the massive elevator shaft that stretched infinitely upward into the darkness of space. The structure was enormous, made of an alien metal that gleamed with a dull silver shine even though it had been dormant for 500 years. Around him, the station hummed with quiet activity. Engineers moved back and forth, checking instruments and taking readings. But David was different. He was not just an engineer looking at numbers on a screen. He was someone who understood machines at a deep level, someone who could feel how they worked by simply being near them. The Alien Council had made their position clear. Humanity was new to space travel. They were primitive compared to the great civilizations that had come before them. The Valorians, the Zethar, and the Ancient Crystalline Collective had all tried to fix this elevator. 3 of the most advanced species in the galaxy had failed. So why would humans succeed? The Council had given humanity one chance, one opportunity to prove that they were more than just newcomers fumbling around with technology they did not understand. Lisa walked up to David with her scanner in hand. She was one of the few people at the station who believed that this task was not impossible. Most of the others had already given up before they even started. Lisa was different. She had worked with David for 3 years now and she knew how his mind worked. She knew that he saw problems differently than others did. "Look at the primary coupling," Lisa said, pointing to the data on her scanner. The screen showed a complex diagram of the elevator's core mechanisms. "I have been analyzing the system for weeks. Something is blocking the release mechanism. It is not a major problem. It is not a catastrophic failure. It is something small. Something tiny." David leaned in closer to examine the data. His eyes moved across the screen carefully, taking in every detail. "How small?" he asked. "Microscopic," Lisa replied. "The other species, they all assumed the problem was complex because the system is so ancient and so advanced. They looked for sophisticated failures. They looked for things that would require sophisticated solutions. But sometimes the biggest problems come from the smallest things." David nodded slowly. He understood what Lisa was saying. He had worked in maintenance for 15 years before joining the space program. He had fixed countless machines, worked on equipment that was decades old, and he had learned something important over all those years. Sometimes a machine broke down not because something was wrong with the machine itself, but because something tiny was in the wrong place. A grain of dirt, a speck of dust, a microscopic crystal that had dislodged from somewhere else and lodged itself in a critical mechanism. "Everyone else has tried complex solutions," David said quietly. "They have brought in their advanced technology. They have used their sophisticated equipment. They have analyzed and reanalyzed the system. But none of them have asked the simple question." "What question?" Lisa asked. "What if the problem is not complicated at all? What if the solution is simple?" David turned away from the scanner and looked up at the massive elevator shaft. "What if all we need to do is remove the obstruction?" Lisa frowned. "The obstruction is microscopic. How would you even reach it? The coupling is protected. The mechanisms are fragile. You cannot just blast it away with energy weapons. You cannot use mechanical force. Any crude approach would damage the entire system beyond repair." "I know," David said. He was already thinking about the problem, already turning it over in his mind. He had worked on old machines before, machines where one wrong move could break everything. He understood the delicacy required. He understood the patience it took to work with systems that were ancient and fragile. David walked through the station toward his quarters. He needed to think about this problem. He needed to consider every possibility. As he walked, he thought about all the machines he had ever worked on. He thought about the times he had fixed something that experts said could not be fixed. He thought about the tools he had used over the years, simple tools that had solved complex problems. When David reached his quarters, he sat down at his desk. On the desk was a small container of paper clips. They were old-fashioned, simple pieces of bent wire. He picked one up and held it in his hand, turning it over slowly. The paperclip was thin, delicate, precise. It was made of metal so it would not break easily. But it was flexible enough to bend slightly if needed. An idea began to form in David's mind. It was such a simple idea that it seemed almost ridiculous. But the best ideas often were simple. The paperclip could be inserted into the microscopic space around the crystalline obstruction. It could be used to probe carefully, to dislodge the crystal without applying too much force. It could be maneuvered with precision, adjusted and readjusted until the crystal came loose. David stood up and walked back to the engineering bay. Lisa was still there, reviewing data. When she saw David, she immediately knew something had changed. There was a look in his eyes, a confidence that had not been there before. "I know how to fix it," David said simply. "How?" Lisa asked. David held up the paperclip. With this. Lisa stared at the paperclip for a long moment. Then she looked at David's face, searching for any sign that he was joking. But David was completely serious. He believed that this simple piece of bent wire could solve a problem that had defeated 3 of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. "You're going to use a paperclip to fix an ancient alien elevator that has been broken for 500 years? Lisa asked slowly. "Yes," David replied. "This paperclip is thin enough to fit into the space around the crystal. It is precise enough to allow me to work carefully. It is simple enough that I can control it completely. And it represents something important about humanity." Lisa did not understand yet what David meant, but she would soon. All of humanity would soon understand. Because David had discovered something that the advanced civilizations had forgotten in their pursuit of complex solutions. He had discovered that sometimes the most powerful tool was not technology at all. Sometimes it was simply understanding how something worked and having the patience to fix it properly. The paperclip gleamed in the light of the engineering bay, small and ordinary and perfectly suited to the task ahead. The observation deck fell silent when David showed the paperclip to the gathered crowd. Lisa stood beside him, watching the reactions of the alien representatives and the human engineers. The Valerian observer, whose name was difficult to pronounce in human language, stood motionless. Its crystalline form caught the light from the viewing screens, creating patterns of refracted color across the walls. But there was nothing beautiful about the creature's expression. It was pure disbelief mixed with what could only be described as barely suppressed laughter. David held the paperclip up to the light so everyone could see it clearly. It was so small compared to the massive machinery they were discussing. It was so ordinary, so common, so utterly unremarkable. In a universe filled with technologies that could bend light and manipulate matter at the molecular level, here was a human holding up a simple piece of bent metal wire. "You cannot be serious," the Valerian observer finally spoke. Its voice was like crystal chiming, beautiful but cold. "You are suggesting that you will repair a system that has been dormant for 5 centuries, a system that was constructed by a civilization that existed before even my species achieved space travel, using a piece of primitive wire?" David did not flinch or hesitate. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." The observation deck erupted into quiet murmuring. Engineers whispered to each other. Some of them were trying to hide their smiles. Others looked genuinely concerned that David had lost his mind. The Valorian skin began to shimmer with colors that David had learned indicated amusement in Valerian culture. The alien was laughing at him, though without making any sound. "Explain this to me," the Valerian said, still emanating waves of barely controlled laughter. "Explain how this paperclip, as I understand humans call it, will accomplish what cannot be accomplished with the most advanced technology available in this region of space." David took a step forward. He had spent the entire night thinking about how to explain this. He knew it sounded ridiculous. He knew that to the advanced species watching him, he must appear foolish. But he also knew that he was right. He could feel it in his bones, in his understanding of how machines worked. "The problem with the elevator is not a complex one," David began. "A microscopic crystal is blocking the release mechanism. This crystal is so small that it was overlooked by the scanning systems of the 3 civilizations that tried to repair this elevator before us. Your technology is so advanced that it looks for major problems. It expects big failures. But sometimes the biggest failures come from the smallest things." The Valerian tilted its head, a gesture that David had learned meant the alien was listening despite its amusement. Lisa was watching David carefully, interested to see where he was going with this explanation. "The other approaches have all tried to use sophisticated solutions," David continued. "Molecular disassemblers, precision energy beams, advanced mechanical tools. All of these are designed to overwhelm a problem through sheer technological power. But this mechanism is ancient. It is delicate. It was designed by a civilization that understood the importance of precision and balance. Using overwhelming force on such a system is like trying to defuse a bomb with a sledgehammer." David held the paperclip higher. "This paperclip is different. It is thin enough to fit into the microscopic space around the crystal. It is flexible enough to be adjusted and controlled. It is simple enough that I can manipulate it with perfect precision. And most importantly, it will not damage the mechanism. When I remove the obstruction, the system will activate naturally. The ancient machinery will do what it was designed to do." "You are insane," the Valerian said, but the amusement in its voice had changed slightly. Now there was something else there, a hint of curiosity mixed with the laughter. Lisa stepped forward. "With respect to the observer, David is not insane. He is thinking differently. Humans come from a young species. We have spent thousands of years fixing things with simple tools. We have learned through experience that complexity is not always the answer. Sometimes the answer is patience, precision, and understanding how something actually works rather than trying to force it to work through superior technology. An old human engineer named Robert spoke up from the back of the room. I worked in maintenance for 40 years before I came to this station. I have seen David fix things that should not have been fixable. He has a gift for understanding how machines work. If he says a paperclip will work, I believe him. The Valerian made a sound that David had heard before, a kind of crystalline humming that indicated intense thought. You realize that if this fails, your species will be seen as foolish across the entire galactic community. The humans who thought they could fix ancient technology with a simple wire. This could damage your standing in the broader civilization significantly. I understand, David said quietly. But I also understand that this will work. And if it does, it will show something important. It will show that sometimes wisdom comes not from complexity, but from simplicity. It will show that understanding a problem is more important than having advanced technology. Lisa placed her hand on David's shoulder. When do you want to start? She asked. Tonight, David replied. The sooner we attempt this, the sooner we will know if it works. The Valerian observer made that humming sound again. I will observe this personally. I will record everything. When this fails, the galaxy will understand why the human species should remain relegated to the fringes of civilized space. But if, by some impossible chance, you succeed, then I will be forced to reconsider everything I know about your kind. David nodded. He was not afraid. He had the paperclip in his hand, and he had something that the advanced civilization seemed to have lost. He had faith in the simple solution. He had patience and understanding. And he had the determination to try something that seemed impossible. As he walked toward the mechanical chamber, David could feel the weight of the galaxy's doubt pressing down on him. But he also felt something else, something stronger. He felt the confidence of someone who understood that sometimes the greatest power came not from technology, but from seeing what others had missed. The paperclip was small and ordinary, but in David's hand, it represented humanity's chance to prove itself to the universe. David entered the mechanical chamber wearing a specialized hard suit designed to protect him from the extreme environment. The suit was bulky and restrictive, but it allowed him to work safely inside the ancient machinery. The chamber was vast, larger than he had expected. The walls were lined with massive gears and mechanisms that had not moved in 500 years. Dust covered everything, ancient dust that had accumulated over centuries of dormancy. The air was cold, processed by the station's life support systems, and David could hear his own breathing inside the suit's helmet. Lisa's voice crackled through the communication system. Can you hear me, David? I hear you, David replied. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, filtered through the suit's communication system. I am in the chamber now. Initiating approach to the primary coupling. David moved slowly through the machinery. Every step had to be careful and deliberate. The floor was covered with debris, and the suit's movements were stiff. He had trained for this in simulation, but simulation never quite prepared you for the reality of actually being inside such a massive structure. The machinery towered around him like the skeleton of some ancient creature from Earth's prehistoric past. The primary coupling mechanism came into view. It was enormous up close, a complex arrangement of metal and crystal that seemed to defy understanding. But David had spent weeks studying the schematics. He knew exactly where the obstruction should be. He could see the tiny gap where the microscopic crystal was lodged, invisible to the naked eye but visible as a dark shadow in the mechanism's geometry. I see the obstruction point, David said into the communication system. Beginning extraction procedures. David pulled the paperclip from his suit's tool pocket. In his gloved hand, the simple piece of wire felt both fragile and impossibly strong. He had bent it carefully before entering the chamber, creating a precise shape that would allow him to manipulate the crystal. The end was curved slightly, designed to catch and lift rather than push. He reached into the gap where the crystal was lodged. The opening was so small that even with the suit's gloves removed momentarily in the pressurized lower section, it would have been difficult to work. But inside the suit, with its thick protective gloves, it was nearly impossible to see what he was doing. David had to work almost entirely by feel, by intuition, by understanding the mechanism and trusting his hands to do what his eyes could not see. How is it going? Lisa asked. Her voice carried concern. She was watching his vital signs, monitoring his heart rate and stress levels. She knew this was an incredibly difficult task. It is harder than I thought, David admitted. He did not lie to Lisa. They had worked together long enough that honesty between them was important. The crystal is embedded deeper than the scans suggested. I need to work very carefully. One wrong move and I could break the mechanism. David spent the next hour working the paperclip into position. He probed gently around the crystal, learning its exact shape and position. He discovered that the crystal was not just a simple obstruction. It was wedged into place by the weight of the mechanism itself. Any crude attempt to remove it would either break the crystal into pieces or damage the coupling itself. But David understood delicate work. He understood the patience required. He had worked on antique machines on Earth before coming to space. He had repaired grandfather clocks from the 1800s, restored old watches that were hundreds of years old. This was the same principle, just on a much larger scale. Everything required finesse, careful manipulation, and respect for the ancient mechanism. Very slowly, David began to lift the crystal. He applied pressure at a precise angle, one that would distribute the weight across the widest possible area of the paperclip. The crystal began to move, just slightly at first. Then a bit more. David could feel the tension in the mechanism, the way the entire structure seemed to be holding its breath. "It is moving," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The crystal is coming loose." Hours passed. David worked continuously, stopping only when the physical strain became too great. He would rest for a few minutes, then continue. The suit's temperature regulation system was working overtime, and sweat covered his body underneath the protective gear. His hands ached from the constant, precise manipulation. Lisa checked in regularly. "How much longer?" "I do not know," David replied honestly. "This is unlike anything I have done before. The mechanism is so old, so fragile. One mistake and it is over." But David did not make a mistake. His hands, guided by 15 years of experience with mechanical systems, continued their careful work. He was no longer thinking about the difficulty of the task. He was no longer aware of his own discomfort or fatigue. He was simply working, focused completely on the crystal and the paperclip and the ancient mechanism that had been waiting 500 years to move again. Then, suddenly, something shifted. The crystal moved free of the coupling mechanism. David felt it clearly, the release of tension, the way the obstruction slipped out of its lodging point. But he did not stop working. He carefully extracted the crystal and the paperclip, pulling both free from the mechanism. "The crystal is out," David said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "The obstruction has been removed." For a moment nothing happened. Then, deep within the ancient machinery, something stirred. A sound began, low at first, then growing louder. It was the sound of gears beginning to turn, of mechanisms that had been frozen for 500 years suddenly coming back to life. "David, the system is activating." Lisa's voice was excited now, filled with wonder. "All the primary systems are coming online. The elevator is waking up." Alarms began to sound throughout the chamber. They were not alarms indicating danger or failure. They were startup alarms, the sounds of an ancient system recognizing that the obstruction had been removed and beginning its ancient purpose once more. David stood in the middle of the mechanical chamber, holding a bent paperclip in his gloved hand, and felt something he had never felt before. He felt the weight of history shifting. He felt humanity proving itself to the galaxy. And it had taken just one simple piece of wire. The entire station trembled as the elevator systems came fully to life. David had made it back to the observation deck just in time to see the massive structure begin its ascent. The elevator car rose smoothly from the planet's surface below, carrying with it the weight of 500 years of silence. Around him, engineers cheered and celebrated. The Valerian observer stood motionless, its crystalline form reflecting the lights of the control screens in patterns that seemed confused and uncertain. Lisa was working frantically at her station, monitoring the systems that were activating one by one. "David, you need to see this," she said, her voice filled with awe. "The power systems are coming online. The communication arrays are activating. Everything is waking up." David moved to stand beside her, looking at the screens that showed the ancient elevator in full operation. It was a sight that no human had ever witnessed. The structure that had been dormant for 500 years was now functioning exactly as it had been designed to function. The power flowed through ancient conduits. The mechanical systems that had not moved in centuries now moved with precision and grace. But something else was happening too. Something that none of them had anticipated. The elevator's communication systems were not just activating. They were broadcasting. Signals were spreading out across the galactic network, traveling through the vast distances of space. These signals were old, encoded in formats that predated even the Valerian civilization. They were distress signals, emergency beacons that had been dormant for 500 years, waiting for someone to restart the connection. "What is happening?" the Valerian observer demanded, moving closer to the main control console. For the first time, its voice did not carry the tone of amusement or superiority. There was something else there now, something that sounded almost like concern. "These signals, they are activating across the network. They are reaching areas of space that have been considered empty for centuries." An older engineer named Robert, who had been monitoring long-range communications, looked up from his screen with wide eyes. "Sir, we are getting responses. There are structures responding to the signals. They are coming from the outer sectors, from areas that were supposed to be abandoned." Lisa and David exchanged looks. They had restarted more than just an elevator. They had reactivated a connection to something much larger, much more complex than anyone had realized. The elevator was not just a simple transportation system. It was part of a vast network, a communication hub for a civilization that had existed long before the current age of space travel. David walked to the main window and looked out at the planet below. There, on the surface, something was beginning to happen. Lights were activating in patterns across the landscape. Structures that had been hidden or dormant were now becoming visible, responding to the signals being transmitted from the elevator system. "There is a structure on the planet," Lisa said, reading from her scanner. "A massive structure. It has been waiting. All this time, it has been waiting for the connection to be restored." The Valerian observer made a sound, a kind of crystalline humming that indicated intense emotion. "This is not what we expected," the creature said. "The elevator was supposed to be a simple mechanism, a tool for transportation. But it is far more than that. It is a key. A key to something that has been locked away for 500 years. Messages began appearing on the communication screens. They were in ancient formats, in languages that the station's translation systems were struggling to decode. But slowly the meaning became clear. These were not random signals. These were responses from other structures, from other parts of the ancient network. Something vast was awakening, something that had been sleeping since before humanity had even discovered the possibility of space travel. David felt the weight of what they had accomplished settling on his shoulders. They had not simply fixed a broken machine. They had opened a door to something much larger. They had awakened the past, and no one knew what might come through that open door. Lisa continued monitoring the signals. "The responses are coming from deep space. From sectors that are hundreds of light years away. There are structures responding from regions that were thought to be completely empty. How is that possible? How can structures so far away be responding so quickly?" "The network," Robert said slowly, understanding dawning on his face. The elevator was not just a physical system. It was connected to something else, something faster than light. A communication network that spans the entire galaxy. A network that has been dormant for 500 years. The Valerian observer approached David directly. When it spoke, its voice carried a tone that the human had never heard before. It was not contempt or amusement. It was something closer to respect, mixed with uncertainty and perhaps even fear. "You have done something remarkable," the creature said. "You have taken a simple approach to a complex problem, and in doing so, you have revealed something that the greatest minds of multiple civilizations did not understand. This elevator, this ancient system, it was more than we knew. Much more." David did not speak. He was too busy trying to comprehend what was happening. He looked at the screens showing the planet's surface, where more and more structures were becoming visible as the ancient network activated. He looked at the signals spreading across space, reaching out to distant systems, awakening connections that had been dormant for 5 centuries. "What have we started?" David asked quietly. No one had an answer. The observation deck fell silent except for the steady beeping of instruments and the soft hum of the station's systems. Outside the window, the elevator continued its work, rising and falling, carrying resources between the planet and the orbital station just as it had been designed to do centuries ago. But now, everything had changed. The ancient civilization that had built this system had left something behind, something that was only now beginning to reveal itself. The elevator was not just a machine. It was a messenger, awakening the galaxy to something that had been forgotten. And it had all started with a paperclip and one human's determination to see that the simplest solution was often the right one. The lights on the planet below grew brighter, and somewhere in the vast darkness of space, other structures began to respond to the signals that humanity had so innocently released. David stood in the observation chamber, watching the elevator rise and fall in endless cycles. Weeks had passed since the initial activation. The ancient system was now operating at full capacity, transporting resources between the planet and the orbital station without interruption. The mystery of what lay on the planet's surface remained largely unexplored. The Galactic Council had requested that humanity wait for official teams to arrive before proceeding further. David did not mind the waiting. He had other things to think about. The Valerian observer entered the chamber slowly. Its crystalline form caught the light as it moved, but there was something different about it now. The rigid posture that had characterized the alien before had softened. The amusement that had filled its earlier interactions had disappeared completely. Now there was only a kind of solemn respect. "Your name is David, correct?" the Valerian asked. The creature moved to stand beside the human, both of them looking out at the endless space beyond the window. "Yes," David replied simply. He did not know why the observer had come to speak with him now, after so many days of silence. "I have been analyzing the situation," the Valerian said. "I have been reviewing the data from the repair process. I have been studying what your species accomplished here. And I have come to a conclusion that troubles me deeply." David waited. He had learned that aliens often took a long time to express complex thoughts. Patience was important in these conversations. "Your species possesses something that we lost," the Valerian continued. "Something that the Zethar lost. Something that the ancient crystalline collective lost long ago. We became so advanced that we forgot how to solve problems. We forgot that complexity is not always the answer. We forgot patience. We forgot intuition. We forgot how to listen to what a system is telling us." The observer turned to face David directly. "When you used that paperclip, you were not using a primitive tool. You were using wisdom. You were demonstrating something that our civilizations abandoned millennia ago. You were showing us that understanding is more powerful than technology. That patience is more valuable than computing power. That simplicity can accomplish what complexity cannot." David listened without interrupting. He understood that the Valerian was struggling with something important, something that challenged everything the alien species believed about themselves and their place in the galaxy. "I have studied your species," the Valerian said. "Humans are young. You are only a few thousand years into your spacefaring age. You do not possess the technology of the ancient civilizations. You do not have the computing power of the Zethar. You do not have the biological understanding of the crystalline collective. But you have something else. You have the ability to see problems clearly because you have not been blinded by centuries of advancement. You have not forgotten how to work with your hands. You have not lost touch with the basic understanding of how things function." David held up the bent paperclip. He had kept it as a memento of what he had accomplished. The metal was slightly worn now from weeks of handling, but it still retained its basic shape. "This is just a tool," David said. "It is simple, but it is effective because it was the right tool for the problem. The other civilizations looked for complex solutions because they could not imagine that a complex problem might have a simple answer." "Precisely," the Valerian said. "And that is what troubles me. My civilization has spent the last 1,000 years becoming more advanced, more powerful, more capable of controlling the universe around us. But we have lost something in that process. We have lost the ability to think simply. We have lost the wisdom that comes from working with systems rather than commanding them." The observer made a sound, that crystalline humming that David had learned indicated deep emotion. "I am going to file a report with the Galactic Council. I am going to tell them what I have witnessed here. I am going to tell them that humanity, despite its youth and its lack of advanced technology, may represent something crucial for the future of our civilization. I am going to recommend that humanity be elevated in standing, that your species be given access to knowledge and resources that have previously been restricted to the oldest civilizations." David was surprised by this announcement. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Because your species understands something fundamental," the Valerian replied. "You understand that the goal is not to be the most powerful or the most advanced. The goal is to solve problems effectively, to understand systems, to work with what you have available, to never accept that something is impossible. These are not primitive values. These are the values that allowed our civilization to achieve its greatest accomplishments in our earliest days." Over the following weeks, David's reputation spread throughout the galactic community. The story of how a human technician had repaired an ancient alien elevator using a paperclip became something of a legend. Some told the story with respect and admiration. Others told it with skepticism, unable to believe that something so simple could accomplish something so significant. But the results could not be denied. The elevator functioned perfectly. The connections to the ancient network were being carefully re-established. And humanity's standing in the galactic community had changed dramatically. Species that had previously ignored human concerns now listened carefully to what humanity had to say. Trade agreements were offered. Knowledge was shared. Humanity was no longer seen as a curiosity or an anomaly. They were beginning to be seen as valuable members of the galactic community. David did not think much about his fame. He returned to his regular work at the station, maintaining the elevator systems and solving problems as they arose. But everything had changed and everyone knew it. The paperclip he had used was eventually placed in a museum, preserved in a special case as a symbol of human ingenuity and determination. Months later, Lisa found David working on one of the elevator's secondary systems. "The exploration team is ready to descend to the planet," she said. "They want you to go with them. They want you to be part of the team that discovers what is waiting down there." David stood up from his work. He looked out the window at the planet below, at the structures that had been awakening slowly over the past months. He thought about everything that had happened, about how one simple idea and one simple tool had changed everything. "Tell them I will be ready," David said. "There is still so much to discover. Still so many problems to solve. And I want to be there when humanity continues to prove itself to the galaxy." As he prepared for the descent, David kept the original paperclip in his pocket. It was bent and worn, but it represented something important. It represented the moment when humanity had shown the galaxy that wisdom was more powerful than technology, that patience was more valuable than complexity, and that sometimes the greatest achievements came from the simplest ideas. The elevator descended toward the planet, carrying with it the hope and determination of humanity.